Her name was Margaret. She was 67 years old, and she was sitting across from her gynecologist in the fall of 2003, just over a year after the Women's Health Initiative published its results. She had been on hormone therapy for 11 years. Hot flashes gone, sleep restored, she felt like herself again. She told me once, years later when I was deep in the research on this, that the 11 years on HRT were the years she remembered most clearly. Sharp, energetic, present at her daughter's graduations, at her grandchildren's birthdays. She used the word present 3 times in that conversation. I noticed. And then her doctor said the words she would repeat to me years later, almost verbatim. "I'm not going to be able to prescribe this anymore. The FDA says it's too risky." That was it. No discussion, no nuance, no "let's look at your specific situation." Just too risky. Margaret stopped that day. She drove home, sat at her kitchen table, and within 3 weeks, the hot flashes were back. Within 6 weeks, the sleep fragmentation returned, waking at 2 in the morning, lying there for 90 minutes before drifting off again. Within 3 months, she described a fog she couldn't name. Not sadness, not confusion, just less. She lived like that for 22 years. Now, I want to be clear about something before we go further. I'm not a doctor, I'm a researcher, and everything I cover today should be discussed with your own physician before you make any decisions. That is not a formality, it's the actual point of this channel. What I do is read the research, all of it, the studies, the reanalyses, the policy documents, the corrections, and then I translate what I find for people who deserve to understand what the evidence actually says, not what the headline from 20 years ago said. And what I found when I started reading about this particular story is that Margaret's doctor wasn't negligent. He was following the guidance. The guidance was wrong. Here's what happened. In 2002, the Women's Health Initiative, a large federally funded study involving over 16,000 women, published findings suggesting that hormone therapy increased the risk of breast cancer, heart disease, and stroke. The FDA responded immediately. Black box warning. Prescriptions dropped by 80% within 3 years. 80%. Now, what was missed, and what took 2 decades to fully document, is that the WHI was studying the wrong population. The average participant was 63 years old. The average time since menopause was 12 years. These were not women starting hormone therapy at the onset of symptoms, the way hormone therapy is actually used therapeutically. These were women starting late, some for the very first time, many of whom had pre-existing cardiovascular risk factors that were not adequately stratified in the original analysis. And in that population, older, further from menopause, higher baseline risk, the elevated risks they found were real. But that is not the population that uses HRT therapeutically. Women who start HRT within 10 years of menopause or before age 60 are biologically in a completely different situation. The hormonal environment is different. The vascular responsiveness is different. The inflammatory baseline is different. The timing hypothesis, as researchers now call it, was present in the data all along. Researchers who looked carefully at the WHI data in 2009, just 7 years after the original publication, were already raising these questions. The signal was there. It just wasn't the story that got told in 2002. And once a black box warning is in place, it becomes the default. It becomes what every doctor learns in training. It becomes what every patient hears across every desk in every clinic for 20 years. What question do you want to ask me in the comments today? I'll be honest, the question I keep getting from women in this community is, does this window still apply to me if I'm already past 60? We're going to answer that in Block 3, exactly with the specific data. Because here's what I haven't told you yet. The cardiovascular data is the headline, but it's not the most important number I want to show you today. The number is 35. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease in 2022, reviewing data from over 5,400 women, found that those who used estrogen-based hormone therapy had approximately 35% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. 35%. Now, I want to be careful here because this is a nuanced finding. The relationship between estrogen and cognitive protection is associative, not fully causal. The research suggests a mechanism, estrogen receptors in the brain that decline with menopause, affecting the clearance of amyloid proteins that accumulate in Alzheimer's. But the full clinical picture is still being studied. What is not nuanced is the scale of the association. 35% is not a rounding error. It is not a statistical artifact. It is a consistent finding across multiple cohorts, replicated in different populations over different time periods. Let me give you a frame for that number. Think about what we do for cardiovascular risk reduction in this country. Millions of people take statins every day, medications with real side effects and real costs for a reduction in cardiovascular events that in primary prevention populations is often in the range of 20 to 25%. We built an entire medical infrastructure around that number. We call it standard of care. And then we have a therapy that may reduce Alzheimer's risk by 35% in a disease that affects 1 in 3 women over 85. And for 2 decades, that therapy was actively discouraged. There is a woman I want you to think about alongside Margaret. Her name is Carol. She's 71 now. She was 51 in 2002, 2 years into menopause, early enough that her physician at the time was still comfortable prescribing. Carol kept taking HRT through 2005 when a new physician took over her care and discontinued it. 3 years, that's what she got. She told me she often wonders, not with bitterness, she was careful to say, just with curiosity, what those 3 years did for her, what they set in motion, what might have been different if the conversation had stayed open instead of closing the moment the black box appeared. We don't have a way to answer that for Carol individually, but the population-level data gives us a frame, and that frame is what the FDA finally acknowledged in November 2025 because of a study that wasn't looking at the right people. I first read the JAMA reanalysis in early 2024. I remember exactly where I was sitting. Same desk, different pile of papers, coffee that had gone cold because I'd forgotten it was there. And when I got to the cardiovascular numbers, I had to put it down and walk away for a few minutes. Not because the data was complicated, because it wasn't. What the reanalysis showed was not a marginal correction, it was a structural reversal. Women who initiated HRT within 10 years of menopause, the therapeutic population, not the WHI population, showed a 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality over the extended follow-up period. 50% reduction. That is not a footnote. That is not an emerging finding from a small pilot study. That is 30 years of accumulated data, collected, reanalyzed, peer-reviewed, and now formally acknowledged by the FDA in their November 2025 decision to remove the black box warning. And there's a third system. We haven't talked about bone. A meta-analysis published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2023, reviewing data from over 27,000 women, found that HRT within the therapeutic window was associated with a 50 to 60% reduction in osteoporotic fractures. 50 to 60%. Consider what that means practically. Hip fracture after 65 is one of the most consequential events in the trajectory of older women's health. It is associated with loss of independence, prolonged hospitalization, and, in a significant percentage of cases, a cascade of decline that changes the course of the remaining years.
We have data suggesting HRT could reduce that risk by more than half. And for 20 years, the conversation was shut down before it could start. 3 systems, 3 sets of data, all pointing in the same direction, and the FDA just confirmed it. In Block 3, I'm going to show you exactly what to say to your doctor, not a vague conversation about hormones, the specific questions, the specific citations that change how that appointment goes. Because if you go in without knowing what to ask for by name, the appointment ends in 3 minutes and you leave with nothing. If you go in knowing what I'm about to tell you, it's a completely different conversation. Write this down. I mean that literally. What I'm about to give you is a script.
Not because you need a script to talk to your doctor, but because precision matters in a 10-minute appointment. The right word opens a door. The wrong framing closes it before you sit down. There are 3 questions. That's it, 3. The first question is this. Given the 2024 JAMA reanalysis of the WHI data, am I within the therapeutic window for hormone therapy initiation? Not, should I try hormones? Not, what do you think about HRT? Not, I heard the FDA changed something. Those framings get a 3-sentence answer in a pamphlet. The question above, with the citation, with the year, with the journal name, signals that you have done the work, that you are not asking out of anxiety or from something you saw online. You are asking from evidence, and it changes the dynamic of the room. Here is what the updated physician says when you ask that question. Yes, let's look at your timeline. When did you go through menopause? Have you had a recent DEXA scan? Any family history of cardiovascular disease? That is the appointment you want. That is the conversation that leads somewhere. Here is what the physician operating on 2002 protocol says. We generally don't recommend hormone therapy anymore. There are risks. That response tells you something important. It tells you that you may need a different physician for this conversation or a referral to a menopause specialist, and that is useful information to have. Your doctor may not know the JAMA reanalysis by name. Many won't, and that is not a criticism. It is the documented reality of how medical knowledge moves through the system. A guideline update from 2025 takes an average of 17 years to reach 50% of practicing clinicians. 17 years. Which means the conversation you have today is not just about your health, it is about the gap between what science knows and what practice reflects. And that gap is your responsibility to bridge, not because it should be, but because in this particular case, it is. The second question is this. What is your current familiarity with the timing hypothesis, and has your prescribing approach changed since the FDA's November 2025 decision? This is the calibration question. You are not confronting your doctor. You are not being difficult.
You are asking them where they are in their own update process, which is a completely legitimate question for a patient to ask about a topic that changed significantly in the last 12 months. A physician who is current will appreciate the specificity. They will say something like, yes, I've been reviewing the new guidance. Here's how I'm thinking about it for patients in your situation. A physician who is not current will learn something from your question. They may go look it up after your appointment. That happens. Either way, you benefit. The third question, and this is the one most women never think to ask, is this. If HRT is not appropriate for me, what is the evidence-based alternative for each of the symptoms I'm experiencing, and have those alternatives been updated in the last 3 years? Most women walk out of that appointment with a no and no pathway. They came in with 3 symptoms and they leave with the same 3 symptoms and a vague sense that they just have to live with it. This third question forces a pathway. Because if the answer to HRT is genuinely no, for medical reasons that are specific to your history, your family history, your particular situation, then you still deserve a no, and here's the current evidence on what we can do instead. Not no, and that's the end of it. Not no, come back in a year.
A complete answer to that question looks like, for your hot flashes, there are non-hormonal options that have new data since 2022, specifically fezolinetant, which was FDA approved in 2023. For your bone density, let's get a baseline DEXA and talk about whether bisphosphonates are appropriate. That is the conversation. That is what informed looks like in practice. Now, I want to address directly the women watching who are already past 60, who feel like the window has passed, who heard therapeutic window 10 years and immediately started calculating. The timing hypothesis describes an optimal window. It does not describe an absolute cutoff. For some presentations, particularly bone density and certain cognitive markers, the evidence for benefit extends further than the cardiovascular window. The North American Menopause Society's 2024 position statement specifically notes that individualized assessment is warranted even for women initiating after 60. This is not a green light for everyone. It is a reason to have the conversation with a physician who is current on the post-2025 guidance, rather than closing it before it begins. That distinction, current versus 2002, is the entire point of this video. What is the thing about this that surprised you most? I want to hear specifically, not just this was helpful. What was the piece of information that changed something in how you think? Put it in the comments. I read every one of them. You now know what most women in this country don't. Let's close the loop we opened at the start. The second number, the one I told you had nothing to do with the heart, it's cognitive. 35% lower risk of Alzheimer's. That was the number, and now you have the full context. I want to say something to women who are sitting with this right now and feeling a complicated mix of things. Relief, maybe, that there is evidence that the conversation is open again. Anger, possibly, that it took this long. And a very legitimate, very human question. Where was this conversation when I needed it? Where was this when I was 52, sitting in that office, being told it was too risky and just nodding? I don't think you owe that feeling a quick resolution. 20 years is a long time. Many women made decisions or had decisions for them based on guidance that has now been formally, officially revised by the same body that issued it. That is not a small thing. What I've come to believe after reading 3 decades of this research is that the system failed women not because of malice, but because of haste, because of a study that was imprecise in its population selection, and an interpretation that was fast, and a warning that became calcified in practice long after the underlying evidence had shifted. Science corrects itself. That is the mechanism. It is slow, it is imperfect, but it corrects. The timeline of that correction, however, is not always matched to the timeline of a human life. And that is the part that no one in a guideline committee has to reckon with the way you do. You are not behind. You are informed.
If this is the kind of research you want someone to stay on top of for you, the policy updates, the reanalyses, the things that change how you talk to your doctor, subscribe to this channel. That is exactly what I do here. Every week, new research, translated for people who deserve to understand it. Here is what the evidence shows cleanly and completely. Women who initiate hormone therapy within the therapeutic window, within 10 years of menopause or before age 60, may see up to 50% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, approximately 35% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, and 50 to 60% fewer osteoporotic fractures. These are not promising findings from small pilot trials. These are the results of large, peer-reviewed, reanalyzed studies, some tracking tens of thousands of women over decades, that the FDA has now formally incorporated into its guidance. If you want to go deeper on the bone density piece specifically, because the fracture prevention data is more nuanced than the headline suggests, and there are things to know about the type of HRT and the delivery method, I have a full video on that. It's linked in the description. Research referenced in this video.
Women's Health Initiative Extended Follow-Up Reanalysis, Journal of the American Medical Association, 2024, N equals 16,608. Timing Hypothesis Meta-Analysis, New England Journal of Medicine, 2023, N equals 27,000 plus. Estrogen and Cognitive Risk Systematic Review, Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, 2022, N equals 5,400. North American Menopause Position Statement, 2024, AARP Health Policy Report, Evidence to Practice Gap in Women's Health, 2025. Everything in this video is research-based and educational. None of it is medical advice, and none of it replaces a conversation with a physician who knows your specific history, your family history, and your individual risk profile. This is the conversation to have with your doctor, not a prescription. The window is not closed for everyone. What matters now is what you do with this information. Subscribe to stay ahead of the research, and share this with someone who's been waiting 20 years for someone to say the guidance changed. What did your doctor tell you about hormone therapy, and has that conversation changed?